So I follow the signs to the end of the road. Don't let the rain make you lose control. And don't be afraid when it's time to go. Just follow your signs to the end of your road.
Hello, welcome to Paramusic Mysteries. I'm Johnny Long, bringing you the third part of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. If you haven't seen the other two videos, I will attach them to this one. But for now, I will give a brief recap. In the early morning hours of June 13th, 1977, 3 Girl Scouts attending Camp Scott in Locust Grove, Oklahoma, would be found murdered. Camp counselor Carla Wilhite would discover the body of Doris Denise Milner lying near the path that led to the showers. As other counselors arrived at the scene, the bodies of Lori Lee Farmer and Michelle Gousset would also be found, still zipped inside their sleeping bags in other nearby locations, which are lost to us now because counselors would move the bodies to the location where authorities would see them when they arrived. As the investigation wore on, there would be 4 suspects. 3 of them would be questioned and released. But a 4th man, by the name of Gene Leroy Hart, a convicted rapist who had been on the run for the last 4 years, would become the #1 suspect and launch the largest manhunt in Oklahoma history. Now, we last left off after the discovery of a cave 2 miles north of Camp Scott. 2 hunters would discover it after they saw that there was evidence of human habitation. After calling authorities, it was found that the cave contained many pieces of possible evidence linking to the murders, particularly items found that were used to modify the flashlight found at the scene. There was also 2 photographs of women, later learned were developed by Hart when he worked as a photographer's assistant at the Granite Reformatory in McAlester, Oklahoma. However, just a few days later, Ella Mae Buckskin, Hart's mother, would announce to the press that she felt that she was being harassed by law enforcement and that the photographs were planted by none other than Sheriff Glenn Weaver himself. There will be more on this, of course, a little later, but it would be the beginning of what would eventually make this case so frustrating. Although this was yet to be reported to the press, another cave was found along what is known as Skunk Mountain, also about 2 miles from the camp. It was discovered after a man by the name of Victor Oxier reported that he saw a man that he thought fit the description of Gene Hart about a week after the murders. Among the things linking the cave to the murders were boot prints that matched the bloody prints found in tent number 8. There were also cigarette butts found, and they were tested for saliva, and it was determined that they had been smoked by a person with type O blood, the same type as Hart's. Hair removed from a bandage was also found to have some of the same microscopic characteristics as Hart's. On the 1st of July, officials would announce that they would be leaving Camp Scott, believing that all the evidence had been gathered. Now, I've often wondered if this wasn't by design, because on the 6th of July, A security guard that had been stationed reported that somebody had tried to enter the camp. After hearing noises and shining a flashlight towards the source, he saw someone running away. Now, the only description that he gave was that this person appeared to be wearing blue jeans. But officials would immediately go to Camp Scott with tracking dogs. The dogs were unable to follow the trail. Now, almost simultaneously, the local newspaper would release an article on the autopsy reports. Now, there were other conflicting reports saying that the girls were not sexually assaulted in any way, which we know that can't be true. Medical examiner Neil A. Hoffman reported that 2 out of the 3 girls were sexually assaulted, and all 3 were molested in some way. On July 29th, 1977, another private security team looking after Camp Scott sees what they think are people in the woods. After coming back from investigating, on the steps of the camp director's house, they would find what was supposedly Doris Denise Milner's wet shoes and socks in a bag. Just like so many other things in this case, even this promising lead would become shrouded in mystery. Now, according to Betty Milner, Doris's mother, she had packed 2 pairs of shoes. 1 pair of shoes was returned. The other pair was still in evidence, which means that there's a 3rd pair of shoes. Now, one of the pairs of socks that was in the bag was pink, and Mrs. Milner did say that 1 pair she packed was pink. But other than that, there still seems to be no clarity on whether or not these shoes actually belong to Doris Denise Milner. Now, after this incident, there doesn't seem to be any more sightings of people trying to enter the camp. And for the next few months, there wouldn't be many reports about any sightings or possible sightings of Jean Leroy Hart. On September 22nd, 1977, 2 of the victims' families would file a $3 million civil suit against the Magic Empire Girl Scout Council. The FBI would also become involved in the search for Hart. On April 6th of 1978, a team of OSBI agents would converge on a home in a remote area of the southeast corner of Cherokee County. The residence belonged to a man named Sam Pigeon, about 45 miles away from Camp Scott, and Hart would be arrested without incident, and he would be transported directly to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. Now, of course, with the capture of Jean Leroy Hart, the media circus would begin. Unfortunately, we would see an all too familiar theme, which would actually become more prevalent in cases in the future. This, of course, started when Ella Mae Buckskin would tell the press that she felt she was being harassed and that she felt her son was innocent of the charges. But keeping all this in mind, it should be noted there was another suspect talked about. This would be a man by the name of William Stevens. Now, William Stevens was convicted for the sexual assault and beating of a school teacher in 1978, and was still a free man during the time of the Camp Scott murders. His co-defendant, Dwayne Peters, is the one who originally contacted the OSBI, telling them that Stevens had confessed to him that he was responsible for the murders. Now, both Peters and Stevens were convicted of the same crime and were even cellmates. But after an interview with the OSBI, Stevens was no longer seriously considered a suspect. Until Stevens' picture was released to the public. A woman by the name of Dean Boyd had contacted defense attorneys stating that after seeing a photograph of Stevens on the news, she believed she had seen him at the diner that she worked in Choteau, Oklahoma, about 12 miles away from Camp Scott. She would say that a man that looked too much like Stevens came into the cafe where she worked between 5 and 6 a.m. on June 13th, 1977. He had been acting strangely. He had mentioned something about having car trouble. He had taken his shirt off, and he kept looking at his boots. She was frightened enough to call authorities before the man left. Now, Stevens would never be charged, but Dean Boyd's testimony would be heard at Hart's upcoming trial, which would begin March 19th, 1979. And during this time, Hart would see an amazing transformation. Hart, who just 13 years previous to this was incarcerated for sexual assault and kidnapping, would suddenly become a nice guy and a football hero. Now, Hart's prior crime was not allowed to be used in this trial, so many did not hear of the similarities between those crimes and some of the things that happened at Camp Scott. As if this case didn't need more controversy, it would come to light that District Attorney Sid Wise had secretly made a deal with a newsman by the name of R.L. Grimsley, who was going to write a book about the case. They had made an agreement between themselves, I guess, where Wise would provide Grimsley with pieces of information that were not publicly known at the time. This would, of course, result in the resignation of Sid Wise as district attorney. Hart's lawyers would call for the other 3 attorneys that were working under Wise at the time to be disqualified from the case, but this was unsuccessful. Wise would be replaced by Buddy Fallis, the district attorney from neighboring Tulsa County, and the trial would resume as planned. But there would be more surprises to come when the trial began. One of the key witnesses for the prosecution, 16-year-old Darren Creekmore, had originally told them that he had visited Hart at one of the caves in the weeks after the killings, but he would recant his testimony by saying he had lied about the visit, hoping to collect a reward. Another key witness, Jimmy Don Bunch, who had known Hart at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, had originally signed a statement in return for parole, said that Hart had confessed to him that he had committed the crimes. However, he would change his testimony by saying Hart actually didn't know whether he had committed the murder because he had been, quote, smoking reefer and drinking wine for 3 days, and that he had woke up in the cave with blood all over him. And of course the defense would try to show that evidence had been planted to intentionally frame Hart for the murders. Alan Little, who was a Mays County jailer at the time of Hart's escape, testified that he had seen the photographs of the women that had supposedly been found in the cave on Sheriff Weaver's desk in his office, implying, of course, that when the photographs were found at the cave, that they had been planted by Weaver. A blue hand mirror belonging to Camp Scott employee Karen Mitchell was also found at Pigeon's home. It had turned up missing about a week before the murders. On the day that Hart was captured, the home was thoroughly searched and turned up nothing. It was on a second search that the mirror would be found. Of course, also suggesting the possibility that the evidence was planted. Another blow to the prosecution would be the bloody boot prints found in tent number 8. The size of the prints were 9.5, and Hart wore a size 11. The red modified flashlight was said to have belonged to Joyce Payne, the girlfriend of Dwayne Peters. She claimed that she had lent the flashlight to Peters and Stevens as they planned to go on a fishing trip just a few weeks before the murders. Now, probably the strongest evidence in support of the prosecution would be the hair, blood, and semen samples found both at the scene of the crime and other places surrounding Camp Scott, such as the caves. Now, this is where things become confusing. I suppose it's probably the technology of the day concerning forensics where there doesn't seem to be the smoking gun needed to get a conviction against Hart. 2 chemists would testify for the defense. One was John T. Wilson, who was the chief forensic chemist for the Kansas City Police Department, told jurors that tests conducted on the hair, blood, and semen samples taken from Hart were unreliable. I see no other explanation on why this would be. Now, Herbert Maxey, who formerly analyzed the hair and semen samples found during the investigation, said that the tests could show similarities to Hart, but that's as far as it goes. And to me, that's one of the most confusing statements of the entire case. But after 10 days of trial, the jury was finally sent to deliberate, and 4 hours later they returned a verdict. Even though they actually deliberated for 5 minutes, they waited so that no one would believe they had made too quick of a decision, and the verdict would read, "Not guilty." The courtroom would erupt in a combination of cheers and gasps, and those involved in law enforcement and the victims' families would be moved to tears. 44 years that have passed since the murders, more things have come to light, both give us some new information and also add to the mystery that has always clouded this case. For one, it was found during the autopsy of Jean Leroy Hart that his vasectomy had indeed failed. Now, I don't know what happened during the trial when it was said that Hart's samples that he gave were unreliable, or why samples collected during the investigation would show similarities to Hart, but as it was said, that's as far as it goes. Now, it should be noted that transcripts from a trial are not kept in the case of an acquittal in the state of Oklahoma. So much of the information about what happened during the trial can only be found through newspaper articles. As for the planting of evidence, some of it does not seem plausible, such as the blue hand mirror, which supposedly had turned up missing a week before the murders, which if Sheriff Weaver had indeed planted this evidence, how did he acquire it after the crime? In my opinion, Sheriff Weaver was on the right track, but much of the evidence that he would have based his findings on were not heard during the trial. When the Mays County Sheriff's Department first began investigating this case, they looked into the history of other known offenders in the area. When they saw the similarities between the murders at Camp Scott and his prior crimes, making Hart at least a person of interest, where he was known to have stolen the eyeglasses of both women that he kidnapped and sexually assaulted. Hart's prior crimes were not allowed to be used in testimony. Therefore, many of the things, such as his fetish for wearing women's eyeglasses, would not have meant anything. He would even be wearing women's glasses when he was captured. Even the burglary committed on the night of the murders at the counselor's tent was also reflective of the burglaries Hart was known to have committed in 1969, in which all the occupants in the places that he burglarized were in their homes asleep. On the night of the murders, when someone was stalking the camp, Carla Wilhite's purse and glasses were stolen, also as she slept just a few feet away. When the search for Hart first began, the piles of eyeglasses and the fact that eyeglasses were stolen, women's eyeglasses, no other kind, it doesn't prove that Hart was the killer, but it does show that it's possible that he could have been there even on the night of the murders. That Hart had brought his own duct tape and nylon rope to the crime that he committed in 1966 could also be compared to the fact that whoever committed the murders at Camp Scott also brought their own duct tape and nylon rope. The things that connected Hart to Camp Scott were circumstantial. Now, circumstantial evidence, the misconception about it is that it isn't as strong as direct evidence. Actually, all evidence is circumstantial in nature. If you only have, say, one piece of circumstantial evidence, it's easier to cast reasonable doubt. But if you have 3 or 4 pieces of circumstantial evidence, then you have a case. For it to prove your case, you have to put all corroborating evidence, circumstantial or not, together to paint a picture that your proposed suspect committed this crime. Because Hart's prior crimes weren't allowed in the testimony, this rendered all the work that they had done putting these pieces together useless. I don't think one can come away from this case believing that just one person perpetrated this crime. Boot prints found in tent number 8 that also matched boot prints found in cave number 2 clearly didn't belong to Hart. They yet certainly belonged to someone who was involved in the crime. And it's also said from the autopsy reports that Michelle Gousset and Lori Lee Farmer had wounds that came from 2 different directions and possibly 2 different weapons. Of course, also indicating the presence of more than one person. Milner was the only one who was strangled. In spite of erroneous reports, even in Wikipedia, that say all 3 girls were strangled, this is not true. Possibly indicates more than one perpetrator. As for the paranormal aspects of this case, was Native American magic being used to aid Hart to escape justice? When investigators receive a message saying that the dogs have been cursed by a powerful medicine man and that they would die soon, and within 3 days the dogs die under mysterious circumstances, even the agents on the field still can't explain what happened. All the dogs, not just the ones who came from Pennsylvania, the wonder dogs as they were called, experienced the same problem, which was not being able to either catch the scent that they were given or the trail would stop cold inexplicably. Is that paranormal? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe somebody knew a trick that really worked, and that's all it amounts to. But it is odd. Was Hart an apprentice with Sam Pigeon to become a medicine man himself? There is a self-portrait that Hart drew that shows himself in traditional Native American ceremonial garb. So it's quite possible that he at least entertained such fantasies. It was believed by some that Hart was trying to become a skinwalker, which explained some of the strange behavior of the dogs when they couldn't catch his scent because he morphed into something else and they couldn't follow. After the trial, Crying Wolf, the other medicine man who was helping the OSBI in the search for Hart, said after the trial that if Hart was actually guilty of the crime, that most likely he would die soon, and within 3 months, indeed, he would die of a heart attack. In 1989, the FBI would perform testing on a semen sample left on a pillowcase from the murder scene. The test showed a 1 out of 7,000 probability that the DNA belonged to Hart. However, on another test conducted in 2008 would prove inconclusive, being that the DNA was so degraded. In 2017, $30,000 was raised to conduct more tests, which as of this time, as best as I can tell, have not been released. Now, in 1996, a private investigator named Ted LaTurner, whom had been hired by a former sheriff some time before to investigate the Girl Scout murders, filed a petition to have the grand jury reopen the case. Although he did not list Hart as a suspect, being that he had already been tried for the crime, he was still connecting Hart with 3 other men. Jack James, Frank Justice, and William Stevens. Now, Frank Justice had reportedly been an acquaintance of Hart's and had even bragged about seeing the writing on the cave wall before the cave was found by law enforcement. And he was questioned in 1990 in connection with the crime, but was very evasive, as it was said, and had troubles remembering where he was living in 1977 during the time of the murders. Now, he would pass away in 1997. His nephew, Jack James, was convicted of killing a man named Freddie Rogers, who had apparently double-crossed him in some way. Neither man has any record that reflects violence towards women or children or anything of that nature, which still leaves William Stevens as the more viable suspect. And LaTurner would interview a man who claims that he had seen what happened on the night of the murders. Gerald Manley, who was a pastor at the time of this interview, claimed that weeks before the murders, he had befriended a group of men who he felt were in need of spiritual guidance. Now, over the course of time, he would get together with these men, play dominoes and other such activities. And among these men were Jack James and Frank Justice. He claims that on the night of the murders, although he doesn't say why, he went in search of the men, a journey which took him near Camp Scott. Now, this was later in the night, and he said he got tired, so he pulled over and decided to sleep for a bit in his car. He would be awakened by two of the men he was looking for, and they urged him to follow them into the camp on foot. And they hiked up to their destination, which would be tent number 8. According to Manley, the murders had already been committed, and the bodies were being carried out to the locations they would be found the next day. Two of the men he recognized as Jack James and Frank Justice. The other men that he did not recognize at the time but would learn, one was William Stevens. The other was a man that they referred to as Leroy. But in spite of the coincidence of this name, Manley claims this was not Gene Leroy Hart. He says for years that he did not recount this story for fear of his own life. Now, clearly, LaTurner believed enough in this man's story to file the petition for the grand jury. Eventually, the petition would be dropped because LaTurner disappeared from the scene. Did Gene Leroy Hart commit these murders? Now, I wish to be fair to all the families, both of the accused and the victims' families, and everyone who may or may not believe that Hart killed these girls. But I personally do think that he was involved. But I think we definitely need to take a closer look at Stevens and maybe that whole situation involving the group of men I just talked about. It just makes you wonder about the validity of that note left in the donut box. The Milners and the Farmers filed a civil suit against Magic Empire Girl Scout Council. Of course, they accused Magic Empire Council of negligence and not telling them about the things that were going on in Camp Scott in the weeks preceding the murders, and also how they handled the entire situation the day the murders happened. Now, the counselors were young, and knowledge about crime scene investigation was not what it is today. Although they disturbed evidence and moved things around, all of this was unintentional. Testimony that they gave about things that were happening on the night of the murders, such as the strange noises that Carla Wilhite heard, that she tried to investigate but could not get to the bottom of, were eerily similar in description to the noises that Hart was said to have made as he was sexually assaulting the two women that he kidnapped in 1966. Now, do I think that they were negligent in this case? I think in some ways very much so. We can talk about the times and how things were different, and they were. But from the sound of things that were going on that night at the camp, there was a complacency going on that probably shouldn't have happened. I cover a lot of this in the first video, giving a timeline of the things that happened that night that were most likely connected to the murders. In the months preceding, all the break-ins that were happening here and there should have warranted more attention. Hiring a security team before they actually did after the murders during the manhunt. However, the civil suit would rule in favor of Magic Empire Council. So unfortunately for the victims' families, there hasn't really been any closure. And I hope someday that whoever did commit this crime will be at least learned. However, no one should forget that this happened because it changed so much and should never be allowed to be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Paramusic Mysteries. There's a few more cases with paranormal overtones that I will cover in the future. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.